Hey, Pioneers folks. So good to be with you yet another year. This time, trying to talk about the current moment we're in and why we need mutuality, movements, and momentum to be able to move ourselves forward. It's been a very difficult last couple of years. We have been and are still experiencing the COVID pandemic. And it's important to realize that this was a shock to our system. COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society. The racial wealth gap, which meant that communities of color were not able to survive the blows of an uneven economy, inadequate healthcare, which here in a chart shows you that Black people died at 1.4 times the rate of white folks. And if we look in Los Angeles County and age adjust for that, we'll see that the Black death rates were twice those of white folks, the Latino death rates 3 times. So COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses of economic precarity, of systematic racial disparities, of inadequate health care. However, it also revealed our mutuality. The number of people who stepped up in mutual aid societies, the food kitchens that stepped forward, communities beginning to care for the unhoused amongst them. And of course, people wearing masks, even if not to just protect themselves, but to protect their neighbors. At the same time, COVID also revealed our division. The fact that there were so many fights around whether to wear masks or even to get vaccinated, fights that certainly erupted in the context of the murder of George Floyd and the reaction to the understanding that racist policing was just the tip of a racist iceberg of unequal access to the environment, to education, and the economy. And we, in fact, need to think about COVID as occurring as part of 3 big hits to the consciousness. COVID itself revealing disparity, the murder of George Floyd and the reckoning around structural racism in the United States. And of course, all of that coming on top of 4 years of a presidential administration that seemed to have cruelty as its main strategy, that wound up trucking in xenophobia, racism, and hate, and that sought to polarize the society. So where does that leave us now? I would argue there is no going back to what we had before. People often use the word recovery, but why would we want to go back to a normal that did not work for so many? With so many crowded into jobs that were high risk and low pay, with so many left without a social safety net, with so many subject to racist policing, racist education, and even racist environmental conditions in terms of climate inequities. Rather than using the term recovery, we need to understand that this is a moment of transformation, and it's going to require reimagination and restructuring to be able to get forward to a model that both recognizes the disparities that have existed, challenges inequality, and begins to lift up our commonalities. So I would suggest to you that what that means going forward is 3 things. First, we need to center the struggle for racial equity and against racism. Second, we need to craft a new economic story that can become common sense, a new economic story that recognizes our mutuality, a new economic story that motivates us for social change. And third, we're only really going to get there if we commit to social movements for change. Now, many of you have been college students before. You will realize that the professor just told you the 3 main points, which probably means you can doze off for the next 10 minutes till I come back to them at the end and then issue a quiz. But really, pay attention. First big thing, we need all of us to have a deep interrogation of how anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism has set the terrain for othering, for xenophobia, for hate, for structural inequality that in fact affects all of us. Even immigrants who come to this country, the terrain of inequality is set by those fundamental dynamics of the taking of land and the taking of labor to amass capital to make this country. So if we really want to make a world that is better, need to center the struggle for racial equity and take it upon ourselves to understand the deep role of anti-Black racism and to understand how important this is going forward. If you're looking at a chart, we're looking at racial inequality in Los Angeles County, where I live, and you'll see a familiar story with white households having median income, half higher, half lower, of about $86,000 a year, Black households about $45,000, Latino households about 52. And that's the disparity most of us pay attention to. But if you look at what's about to happen in this chart, same scale on the left-hand side, but now we're focusing in on households with children under the age of 5. Watch what happens to those disparities. For children with households with children under the age of 5, the household income median, half higher, half lower, for white households, about $124,000 a year, where for Black and Latino households, it's about $51,000 a year. What does that mean? It means that we're baking racial inequality in to the conditions that face Black and brown children. You see this in the inadequate schools. You see this in the environmental injustices that cause asthma and health conditions and learning challenges. You see that we're baking this into the future unless we center it and address it. What about the second point of a very different economic narrative? Well, turns out we've been working on that. My colleague Chris Benner and I have been trying to develop a new narrative about the economy that we call solidarity economics. There's a new book about it, Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. And some of you who have written books know that one of the frustrating things about writing a book is that no matter how long it is, and in this case this book is about 280 pages long, you realize at the end that you really made just 3 key points. So let me make them for you and save you time, although that's no reason for you not to buy this really excellent book. First point is that we should stop talking about the economy and always talk about our economy. When we talk about the economy, it makes it seem like it's a set of natural laws, things given by God, the market, that's outside of us. But it's our economy. These are the rules we make about whether to compete or to collaborate. It's a tax system that either lets Amazon go off scot-free with no taxes or ensures that they pay taxes and treat their workers decently. We should always go back to talking about our economy, the set of rules we set up and use to either protect property or to protect people. Second big point is that we need to recognize that mutuality actually drives our economy and stress how mutuality, fairness, and inclusion can generate prosperity for the many. Now, this is a really key point because even progressives sometimes seem like they accept the arguments of conservatives that inclusion might be a good thing morally, but somehow it's going to come at the cost of economic prosperity. But you know that when you have a society that's underinvesting in young people, you're not going to have more productivity in the future. You know when you've got a system of over-policing and over-incarcerating that you're wasting talent that could contribute. You know when you are not legalizing people who've been in this country, perhaps without papers, but for quite a long period of time. You're not only disenfranchising them politically, you're disenfranchising them economically, and you're wasting their talents and ability to contribute. And research is showing that those metropolitan areas that are more equal, less residentially segregated, and less fragmented actually tend to grow more sustainably over time. Now, you might be looking at me and thinking, that must be some crazy leftist research. This is research that's also been corroborated by those well-known left-leaning organizations like the Federal Reserve and the International Monetary Fund. We need to claim the argument that treating better people better and decently will actually lift up prosperity for most of us. You know this in your bones. You know that when businesses treat their customers better, their suppliers better, and their workers better, they do better in the long haul. Third big point is that we need to recognize that some people do benefit from the current state of affairs. And because of this, social movements are necessary to generate change. When you see how the 1% has been running away from the rest of us, with its share of national income continuing to go up and social distance mounting and mounting, we know that some people do benefit, even though most of us would gain from inclusion and investment in all of us. And so we need movements like the Fight for 15, the Fight for Immigrant Rights, the fight to house the unhoused, to make sure that we can actually change things. We also know that the other side effect of movements is just as markets make us selfish. They teach us to be self-interested, look out for ourselves and someone instead of someone else, and see the world as zero sum. Just as markets make us selfish, movements make us mutual. They build the habits of solidarity, intersectionality, and mutual consideration that are key to make our economy function for all of us. So what does it mean to adopt a solidarity economics frame? It means that we would see the power of the care economy. We would understand that the jobs that are growing are not just in high tech, that growing more rapidly are jobs taking care of our elders, taking care of our young, and we need to improve the working conditions there if we're to have a more prosperous society. We would understand the need to talk about social housing to make sure that everybody has a place to live. We would understand that large tech companies are benefiting from our data, and because of that, they ought to pay a wealth tax that comes back to us as a solidarity dividend. The other thing we would understand is that racism even affects the environment. Research shows that those metropolitan areas that have bigger disparities of exposure in terms of pollution actually just have more exposure. When people are thinking that they can put the environmental problems in someone else's backyard, there's just more environmental problems. So racial equity is actually key to addressing the overall climate crisis. And speaking of that, solidarity economics insists that we should address the climate crisis, not just because there's a cost benefit analysis of how that would be good for us in the long run, but simply that we need to move past an extractive relationship with the planet and understand that we must stand in solidarity with the planet, with other species, to make sure, and with future generations, to make sure we have a planet that lasts. Now, last key point is that we're not going to get there unless we begin to understand that what's going on is that the traditional sort of political poles between individualism and collectivism, sort of between the traditional libertarian element of the Republican Party and progressive elements, including the left of the Democratic Party, have been replaced by tribalism on the right and mutuality, I think, of progressives. And in that struggle, we need to be insisting on mutuality. So we need new policies to be sure, but we need new politics and new practices. We're going to need to build connections between issues. We're going to need to bring our communities together. We're going to need to forge common ground, even as we recognize the existing disparities that separate us and create even larger problems for certain communities. Finally, that means we need to commit to social movements. There's a famous quote from Martin Luther King. He actually borrowed it from someone else, which is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Let me add, pioneers, but it requires that someone bend it. It doesn't get to justice just on its own. That's going to require you. It's going to require you working with others. It's going to require broad social movements that challenge the constellation of political power, that challenge economic and racial privilege, and insist on mutuality as the guiding principle for our economy and solidarity economics as our framework for getting forward. So glad to be with you today.